Hello, Tabernacle family, and welcome to our walk through the Psalms on this Wednesday, April the 29th. We are very close to nearing the end of this walk through the Psalms, and we're looking forward to concluding it tomorrow with Pastor Hooks. This morning, we're going to be reading Psalm 141 through Psalm 145, and so I hope that you have your Bibles there. Psalm chapter, or the 141st Psalm. The Bible says, "Lord, I cry unto thee, make haste unto me, give ear unto my voice when I cry unto thee. Let my prayer be set forth before thee as incense, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." This psalm is written as David is in the cave En Gedi. He's fleeing from Saul for his life, and as you read through the Old Testament, you find that a very interesting thing takes place here in the cave En Gedi. Saul, who is chasing David, enters that cave unaware that David and his men are in the cave, and David makes his presence known to Saul after he leaves the cave. And with that in mind, this psalm takes on a whole new light. If you look there at verse number 1, it says, "Lord, I cry unto thee, make haste unto me, give ear unto my voice when I cry." David is crying here. It's not just a prayer. This is much more than a prayer. This is painful. Perhaps this is very feeble. I'm sure we've all been there. When a prayer did not seem to be the thing that we were doing, it was more than a prayer. It was our heart crying out to God. And David is crying here. Imagine where he is at this moment. Imagine the trouble that he is in. And he cries to the Lord. And then he uses this very picturesque speech in verse 2. He says, "Let my prayer be set forth before thee as incense, and the lifting up of mine hands as the evening sacrifice." Here is David's prayer ascending up to God. And then he says something very interesting. He says, "And the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." This is what prayer is to be. So often our prayer to God is just a list of, "Lord, do this and do this and do this and do this." And David says, "No, my prayer is a sacrifice to you. Not my will, but thine be done." This is the essence of prayer. Prayer is not trying to get from God everything that we desire. Prayer is trying to enter into the heart of God and get from Him what He desires for us. And David cries and he says, "Lord, I'm lifting my prayer, my heart to you." Verse number 3, "Set a watch, O Lord, before my mouth. Keep the door of my lips. Incline not my heart to any evil thing, to practice wicked works with men that work iniquity, and let me not eat of their dainties." David says, "I'm tempted to speak out against Saul. I'm tempted to speak out against his injustice, but he is God's anointed. So, Lord, would you set a watch over my mouth?" And of course, that is a great prayer for all of us. He says, "Incline not my heart to any evil thing, to practice wicked works with men that work iniquity, and let me not eat of their dainties." Lord, let me not take Saul's methods. Let me not adopt Saul's way of doing things. Lord, let me stay right with you. And then in verse number 5, he says, I'd rather let the righteous smite me. It shall be a kindness, and let him reprove me. It shall be an excellent oil, which shall not break my head. For yet my prayer also shall be in their calamities. When their judges are overthrown in stony places, they shall hear my words, for they are sweet. So in verse 5, he says, Lord, I'd rather suffer with the righteous than to adopt Saul's methods of doing things. Lord, keep me right. And then in verse 5, he speaks of these stony places. Again, the cave, geographically speaking, where he's at, this cave. And David says, in stony places, they shall hear my words, for they are sweet. When David stepped out of that cave and cried after Saul and got his attention, David spoke so sweetly, so tenderly, so respectfully to the authority in his life. And David says this in the Psalms. In verse number 7, our bones are scattered as at the grave's mouth, as when one cutteth and cleaveth wood upon the earth. But mine eyes are unto thee, O God the Lord, and thee is my trust. Leave not my soul destitute. Keep me from the snares which they have laid for me, and the gins of the workers of iniquity. Let the wicked fall into their own nets, whilst that I withal escape. David is praying here that the Lord would give him deliverance from this cave. We move on to Psalm 142, but we do not leave David out of a cave, because once again, that is where we find David in a cave. This is a psalm, but it is a maskil. And this is a peculiar psalm because it is not just a psalm, but also it is a psalm of wisdom and instruction. David is teaching us something here. Well, what is he teaching us? David is teaching us by example in this psalm how we are to pray in times of trouble. So let's dive right in. Verse 1, I cried unto the Lord with my voice unto the Lord did I make my supplication. I poured out my supplication before him. I showed before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, when thou knewest my path and the way wherein I walked, have they privily laid a snare for me. So David is not speaking in present tense, he is reflecting now. He does not say, Lord, I cry, but rather I cried unto the Lord with my voice. And this is something that David remembers as he's in the cave. Now, perhaps he's not in the cave in Gedi. Perhaps this is at the very beginning of David's running from Saul, and he would be in the cave Adullam. And he finds himself there all alone. And he says, I cried unto the Lord. I remember when I prayed that prayer. And verse number 2, I poured out my complaint before him. In the 23rd Psalm, David said, of the goodness of the Lord, my cup runneth over. Well, this is another cup in David's life that's running over. It is not the cup of the goodness of the Lord, though that cup is continually to be running over. This is a different cup. It is a cup of trouble. It's a cup of sorrow, and David says it is just pouring out of me. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. David said, I rehearsed before God all of the things that are going on in my life. In verse number 3, he says, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. David reminds himself that this is not news to God. God is not troubled by my trouble. Now, he cares about my trouble, but he's not troubled by it. God knew that my trouble was coming. He knows how long it will last. He knows the lessons he's trying to teach me in this trouble. He knows all the works that he's going to accomplish through it. God is not troubled by my trouble. David said, you knew it. Lord, you knew it. In verse number 4, I looked on my right hand and beheld, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. I cried unto thee, O Lord. I said, thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. David said, I looked everywhere. David was not short on friends for lack of trying. He was short on friends because there weren't any around. And David discovered a great truth, and that is that when God is all you have, you know that he really is all that you need. In verse 4, he says, I looked everywhere, but there was nobody. And then I cried unto thee, Lord, because thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. Attend unto my cry, he says, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name. The righteous shall compass me about, for thou shalt deal bountifully with me. David prays here in faith for God to be praised. Lord, it's not about you. It's not about me, rather, but it is all about you. He says that thou, in verse number 7, bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name, that the righteous shall compass me about, for thou shalt deal bountifully with me. Moving on, the 143rd Psalm, a very unique psalm as well. This 143rd Psalm has been known for many, many years, really from antiquity, as one of the penitential psalms, a psalm of penitence and confession. But really, just even a brief reading of it shows that it is not that at all. Really, this is a vindication psalm. It is David wanting to be vindicated of his own integrity. And as we read through it quickly, we'll understand that. Verse 1, hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplication. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness, and enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified. When David asks for vindication, he does not ask for it thinking that he is perfect. He says here in verse 2, enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified. He says, I know I'm not perfect, Lord, but I do know that in this case, I've done nothing wrong. And so, Lord, would you vindicate me from my enemies? Verse 3, for the enemy hath persecuted my soul. He hath smitten my life down to the ground. He hath made me to dwell in darkness as those that have been long dead. Therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. I muse on the works of thy hands. David says, I remember the days of old. Now, perhaps this is Absalom that David is wanting to be vindicated from. And perhaps he's looking back on times before in his life when he saw the work of God, how God protected him as Saul was pursuing him. And David says, I remember those days. I meditate on them. Skip down, if you would, to verse number 9. Deliver me, O Lord, from mine enemies. I flee unto thee to hide me. Teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. Thy spirit is good. Lead me into the land of uprightness. Quicken me, O Lord, for thy name's sake. For thy righteousness' sake, bring my soul out of trouble, and of thy mercy, cut off mine enemies, and destroy all them that afflict my soul. For I am thy servant. And David says, Lord, would you vindicate the fact that I am your servant, that I am trying to do the right thing. And of course, opposition comes to all who are doing right. All that live godly shall suffer persecution. And David says, I'm your servant, would you vindicate me? Psalm 144, this is a psalm that sort of turns the corner, if you would. All the preceding psalms have been psalms of distress, and this is now a psalm of praise and of request. David says, Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight. My goodness and my fortress, my high tower and my deliverer, my shield, and he in whom I trust, who subdueth my people under me. What we find here in this psalm is divisions. We have several verses of praise, several verses of reflection, and then several verses of request that are followed then by one verse of praise, one verse of reflection, and one verse of request, leading to a result. Verses 1 through 2 are the praise. Verses 3 through 4, as you read through them, are the reflection on what is man that thou art mindful of him. And this Psalm 144 has a great deal in common with the 18th Psalm. And then there's David's request in verse 5 through 8, and that is to be freed and to be removed from the control of these strange children. We find that phrase twice, once in verse 7, once in verse number 11. He says in verse 11, Rid me and deliver me from the hand of strange children, whose mouth speaketh vanity, and their right hand is a right hand of falsehood. And then he says in the last 4 verses, David gives the result of all of this, and that is this, verse 12, that our sons may be as plants, grown up in their youth, that our daughters may be as cornerstones polished after the similitude of a palace, that our garners may be full, affording all manner of store, that our sheep may bring forth thousands and 10,000s in our streets, that our oxen may be strong to labor, that there be no breaking in nor going out, that there be no complaining in our streets. Happy is that people that is in such a case, yea, happy is that people whose God is the Lord. And David says the result of these things is this society where our sons are plants grown up in their youth, our daughters are cornerstones, our garners are full, the storehouses are full, our livestock are reproducing, everything is great, there's no theft and stealing. He says, happy is that people. And of course, we know that this is only going to happen, this perfect society is only going to happen when Christ rules and reigns on this earth. And when that does happen, then we know that happy is that people that is in such a case. Yea, happy is that people whose God is the Lord. We conclude this morning with Psalm 145, and this psalm really needs no great wording to go with it, no explanation. This is just a straight-up psalm of praise to God. There are some interesting things that I'll bring to your attention very quickly, though. Psalm 145 and verse number 1, I will extol thee, my God, O King. That word extol means not only to praise, but to praise boisterously, loudly, outwardly. And David says, I will extol thee, my God, O King. And I will bless thy name forever and ever. Every day will I bless thee, and I will praise thy name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. In verse number 4, I'll bring your attention to the word generation. And then in verse number 13, you also find the word generation. And these are sort of bookends to this great thought. David says in verse 4, one generation shall praise thy works to another and shall declare thy mighty works. If you go down to verse number 6, it says, and men shall speak of the might of thy terrible acts, and I will declare thy greatness. They shall abundantly utter the memory of thy great goodness and shall sing of thy righteousness. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger, and of great mercy. David is quoting from the book of Exodus when God says to Moses, as he appears to him on Mount Sinai, he says that I, the Lord, am full of compassion, slow to anger, and of great mercy. And the narrative that David is giving to us here is this wonderful progression as one generation who experienced those mighty works, those terrible works, verse number 6, of God there at the mountain, as God speaks to Moses. And those people experience that, and then they pass that on from generation to generation, and they remember the works of God. They remember his praises, and they speak those praises. In verse 12, to make known to the sons of men his mighty acts and the glorious majesty of his kingdom. Thy kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and thy dominion endureth throughout all generations. He continues, the Lord upholdeth all that fall, and raiseth up all those that be bowed down. This psalm concludes the last few verses as we read through. In verse number 20, the Lord preserveth all them that love him, but all the wicked will he destroy. My mouth shall speak the praise of the Lord, and let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. As we conclude our time together in the Psalms, may I encourage us all to remember this last verse, this last phrase, let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. And so may God help us to be people who are blessing his name as we remember his goodness to us. We're praying for you all today. We miss seeing you. Be in prayer for our pastor. He'll be with us tomorrow as we conclude this walk through the Psalms. God bless you. Have a great day.